And welcome back to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. On this week's episode, Art Pepper, his life and times and best hits, and during this hour, we're going to be talking about some of his best albums of all time. Here's a quick recap of what's coming up during this hour. The first one's called Art Pepper Plus 11, released in 1960. The story of this album begins with Marty Piach, who was an arranger for several legendary musicians at the time, from Chet Baker to Ella Fitzgerald and more. So Pepper appears on several albums arranged by Marty Piach. This is one example. And on this album, it's his first appearance on a Marty Piach album as band leader. Getting Together was released in 1960. This album sees Pepper performing alongside Miles Davis' rhythm section. An album called Smack Up, released in 1960. The name of this album stems from the title track, a Harold Land's composition. Pepper is on top form on these tracks. This album showcases how Art Pepper was trying out new adventurous themes with his music. Some of the features of his playing in this album: a very swinging style, snappy staccato phrasing, and a more emotional approach to the melodies. So that was a quick recap of what's coming up during this hour, and this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. We're going for a short break. We'll be right back after that. Stay tuned. And welcome back to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. On this week's episode, Art Pepper, his life and times and best hits, and during this hour, we're going to be talking about more of his best albums of all time. The first one's called Art Pepper Plus 11, released in 1960. The story of this album begins with Marty Piach, who was an arranger for several legendary musicians at the time, from Chet Baker to Ella Fitzgerald and more. His ideas were inspired by Miles Davis' nonet in the 50s, and he typically produced very swinging charts for medium-sized bands. So Pepper appears on several albums arranged by Marty Piach. This is one example. And on this album, it's his first appearance on a Marty Piach album as band leader. His band comprised 16 musicians, various jazz artists from Los Angeles like Mel Lewis and Al Pacino, and together they take us through a selection of modern jazz classics. Pepper makes an appearance on tenor sax on the opening track, Denzil's Best Move, and also on another track, Air Gin, a Sonny Rollins hit, where he appears on alto sax. He also plays clarinet on one track, Anthropology by Charlie Parker. He started out playing the clarinet in his early days, and this track showcases his prowess at the instrument. Getting Together was released in 1960. This album sees Pepper performing alongside Miles Davis' rhythm section. So in a sense, it was a sequel to Art Pepper Meets the Rhythm Section, a previous album of like vein. There had been some changes in the rhythm section at the time of this album. Red Garland had been replaced as pianist by Wynton Kelly, and Jimmy Cobb was drummer instead of Philly Joe Jones. Paul Chambers was still the bass player. There was also a new player that Pepper had not performed alongside in the previous album, Conte Candoli on trumpet. Overall, that rhythm section produced some of the most swinging melodies of all time, especially apparent on the tracks like Biju the Poodle. Another one of the standout tracks from the album, a song called Diane, that Pepper composed as a beautiful tribute to his wife. An album called Smack Up, released in 1960. The name of this album stems from the title track, a Harold Land's composition. Pepper is on top form on these tracks. So he's joined on this album by a series of West Coast musicians, and they take us through some saxophone-themed tunes associated with saxophonists who recorded under the Contemporary Records label. For example, the track La Cuevas de Mario, a blues track composed by Pepper. One of the features of this melody was that it follows a 5/4 time signature, which was an unusual time signature for that melody. Unusual time signatures had been used by artists before, like Dave Brubeck's Time Out, which was themed on the same thing, but it was still relatively novel as a concept. And this album showcases how Art Pepper was trying out new adventurous themes with his music. Some of the features of his playing in this album: a very swinging style, snappy staccato phrasing, and a more emotional approach to the melodies. There's a beautiful rendition of an Ornette Coleman blues track, Tears Inside. Pepper had always been a great fan of Ornette Coleman, who was also a rising star in the jazz scene at the time. So Art Pepper was born on September 1st, 1925 in Los Angeles. He was one of the leading alto saxophonists in jazz. He started out in the 40s playing alongside the Stan Kenton Orchestra and the Benny Carter Orchestra. By the 50s, he'd carved a niche for himself as a leading jazz saxophonist. He went on to place second in the 1952 Downbeat Readers poll in the Best Alto Saxophonist category. Art Pepper, along with others like Chet Baker and Gerry Mulligan, came to define what was known as the West Coast jazz style. In the late 60s, he joined Buddy Richard's big band and also toured Japan and Europe at the time. Some of his best albums include Art Pepper Meets the Rhythm Section, Art Pepper Plus 11, Getting Together, and Smack Up. So that was a quick insight into his biography. Now let's talk about some of his best albums of all time. The first one's called Surf Ride, released in 1952. Pepper was always held in high regard as a cool jazz musician. His style was also somewhat more fiery in temperament than typical cool jazz styles. The songs in this album depict that. There's a lot of Pepper originals in the album, and many of them are based on old jazz standards. Art Pepper Meets the Rhythm Section was released in 1957. This album was one of his most famous albums. Many of the band members collaborating with him on this album were from Miles Davis Quintet. There was Red Garland on piano, Paul Chambers on bass, and Philly Joe Jones on drums. Smack Up was released in 1960. This album showcases how Art Pepper was trying out new adventurous themes with his music. Some of the features of his playing in this album: a very swinging style, snappy staccato phrasing, and a more emotional approach to the melodies. The complete Village Vanguard Sessions was released in 1977. In 1977, Art Pepper took part in a series of concerts at the legendary Village Vanguard Club in New York City. He served on alto, tenor saxophone and on clarinet in the tracks. So this album is a great glimpse into his playing in a live setting. And Winter Moon, released in 1979, this one's a unique album because it pits Art Pepper against a string section. He comes across as a great ballad player in the tracks. Most of the tracks are slow, melancholy tracks. So that was a quick insight into the life and times and best hits of Art Pepper, and that brings me to an end of this week's episode of The Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva. You can check out the archives of today's program on my YouTube channel, The Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan. And on that note, I'll see you again next week. Have a great week ahead.